Today, we'll be looking at national security questions. We'll be looking at the China Initiative, which was launched in 2018 and is headed by Mr. Demers. We are extremely fortunate to have him with us today. First off, he has been in this position for better than 2.5 years. It's not his first federal paycheck. He has previously served as a clerk for the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, and he was part of the original leadership team when the Justice Department's National Security Division was created in 2006. He left government in 2009 and worked in the private sector, serving ultimately as the vice president of the Boeing company and assistant general counsel. He wore a number of hats at Boeing, working with government affairs, international questions, a lot of different things. We are so fortunate to have Mr. John Demers with us. We've previously had with us some critics of the China Initiative, and we've had other people who have talked about problems in Chinese investing in the United States. But today, we have the person who leads these efforts with us. Mr. Demers, welcome.
Great. Thank you, Clay. And thanks to the Institute for hosting this, and thanks to all of you who are joining this afternoon to listen in.
Today, we're looking at two big issues. The first is the question of economic espionage. That is the theft of intellectual property and trade secrets, which are, of course, both key to American innovation and economic well-being. The second issue is how worries about national security may affect American openness to investment from China and the operations of Chinese companies in the United States. This is not just about TikTok. This is about a lot of different things. Mr. Demers, if I could begin by asking you, since you were the one tapped by then Attorney General Jeff Sessions to lead this China Initiative, what prompted it? What caused the department to create the China Initiative? Was it because that the threat from China changed, or simply that our understanding of that threat changed? The department pursued cases of hacking and things like that before, but the China Initiative is distinct. Could you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. Thanks, Clay, very much. So the China Initiative, started in 2018 and was really the organic outgrowth of the daily intelligence briefings that the Attorney General and I were receiving from across the intelligence community about a variety of threats. But one of the topics that's really struck us as continually coming up was this issue of Chinese theft of intellectual property. Now, that, as you said, that's not new. The department indicted its first case back in 2014 against 12 members of the People's Liberation Army of China for their cyber intrusion, stealing commercial intellectual property on behalf of Chinese, let's say, private sector or Chinese companies. So it wasn't entirely new, but it was an effort, and it continues to be an effort to organize our efforts better in this regard, and really was an answer to the Attorney General's question, which was, what more can we do to try to address this issue from our perspective? How can we work with the private sector? How can we work with academia and universities to help them protect themselves from the risks they face in terms of Chinese economic espionage? There's a piece of it, too, that has concerned itself with more traditional political espionage, and we've charged a number of cases over the last 2 years, I think 7 or 8 political espionage cases involving China as the actor. Unfortunately, many of those involve ex-US intelligence officers who have been co-opted by the Chinese intelligence services to spy on behalf of China. But the focus of the initiative was on the economic side. And it was, in addition to what we could do more, on the investigation prosecutorial side, also I think some of the questions, some of the issues that you were referring to in terms of, foreign investment and telecommunications, in particular security, FCC licensing issues. And we can get into all that as we get along if you want. But so it has both of the investigation prong and then the kind of, foreign investment piece of it as well.
Now, thank you. And let's focus first on this intellectual property question and theft of secrets, but also many of the cases that have happened in academia have involved, essentially failure to declare. Not being upfront about relationships with various institutions. And when you've announced some of those cases, either indictments, in a couple of cases, guilty pleas and things like that, you've highlighted the 1,000 Talents program.
Right.
One of China's talent recruitment efforts.
Right.
So if you could say something about that, the relationship between a Chinese government effort to strengthen its own innovative capacity,
right,
and the role of American researchers.
Right. So with respect to the 1,000 Talents program, so I'm sure most of the people who are on this call know, but basically, there are a series of programs in China. We can refer to them collectively as the 1,000 Talents program, but they're instituted by China on the sort of the lawful side, the good side. They're basically efforts to recruit the most talented individuals around the world in a variety of fields. No different than the kind of HR efforts that, say, any U.S. company might do or a university might do to recruit the best professors or researchers in a certain field. That is the legitimate version of it, and there's clearly an aspect of that program that is clearly legitimate. The underbelly of the program is that it has been used by China also to create ultimately what are kind of conflicts of interest or conflicts of commitments on the part of individuals here and in other Western countries who continue to work for their employers. Right. And we've had some on the corporate side as well as on the university side, but most of them have been on the university side, so I'll stick to that. So they continue to do research and teach at their universities, but they have affiliations. They're getting funding from, they're getting payments from the Chinese government or its regional governments. And those, if they were open and declared, there'd be no problem with that, right? So what we focused on are places or cases in which the individuals have actively hidden their participation in these programs, oftentimes contrary to the school's conflict of interest and conflict of commitment policy. So in all the cases but one, it was hidden from the school. In one case, actually, the professor was open about it with the school, and then the school hid it from the U.S. government in a grant application. But most of them, and so the effect of hiding it from the school, in addition to taking advantage of the school. So, for instance, in one case, we had an individual who was a member of the 1,000 Talents programs, undisclosed. As part of his commitment, he was required to go and teach in China for a year. And so how was he going to do this with the school? And when he went to the school and he pretended that he needed paternity leave for a year, when in fact what he was doing was fulfilling his 1,000 Talents responsibility. So just give you an example of the kind of conduct that we're talking about. And then that causes the universities to make false representations or omissions to the federal government, oftentimes in the grant applications, where you have to disclose other sources of funding so that the federal funding agency, National Science Foundation, NIH, whoever it is, can assess whether they want to fund that program or they'd rather fund a competing person. So our focus on the university side has been to try to vindicate, I think, what are academic values of transparency and integrity. So we're not telling the schools, you can't have professors who participate in these programs, right? We're not even telling the professor, you can't participate in these programs. What we're saying is, if you're going to participate in these programs, you have to declare it, and school, you should have mechanisms in place so that you're aware. And then ultimately the school can decide whether that's consistent with its mission or not. So in one of the most high profile cases we have, which is still ongoing, and these are still allegations, but the one of the Harvard chemistry professor, Lieber, he had entered into sort of a collaboration in which he was using Harvard's name and identity and seal with a Chinese university to set up an institute in China. That's, as anyone in an academic environment knows, that's not something the school is crazy about when it doesn't know about it, right? And so that's really where we've been. We're not, unless the research itself is classified, and there are some universities that do classified research, unless it's controlled information under the trade control regimes, we are not going to be telling the university, as sometimes we're asked, should I have someone here who does AI research from China? Say, if you want to, yeah. I want to educate you on what the risks are, but ultimately that's going to be your decision as long as, the government's not funding the project. So that's been the focus, and that's why you see the cases that you've seen are charged less as theft of intellectual properties, because we're kind of letting the school make that decision, and more as, fraud, false representations, and ultimately tax fraud sometimes if the person's taking money they're not paying taxes on it, et cetera.
Yeah, so that's, I think, everybody that's on the call gets that. They understand that if you lie to your employer, you don't fully represent
right.
what it is you're doing, and you may be using university resources, part of which have been provided by federal grants or something like that. That's a problem.
Right.
Problem. And I understand that, in some cases, the universities have brought cases to you.
Right. Yes. Yep.
And so I think we get that. I believe that the key worry is the question of racial profiling, of ethnic profiling, of targeting individuals who by reasons of birth or travel have contact with China. And that it's, as you've no doubt heard with regard to allegations of racial profiling, driving while black becomes dangerous, that sort of notion.
Right.
And here it's, doing research while Chinese.
Right.
That sort of thing. And so the Chinese idiom is to kill the chicken to scare the monkey. So we get a few cases so as to intimidate, educate, choose your verb, this population. What is in place at the Department of Justice to ensure that this program doesn't unfairly target those people of Chinese ethnicity and people with strong connections to China?
Yeah. So look, first of all, we have been sensitive to that issue since the beginning of this. And we've tried, as we talk about this, to very much focus on the actions of the Chinese government, not just in what we're doing, but even in the way in which that we talk about it, so that it's clear what we're focused on is behavior. And we start with the behavior of the government in China, the People's Republic of China. That said, there are clearly a number of cases where the defendants have not been of Chinese origin or ethnicity, including the fellow at Harvard who I gave, Lookman down in New Mexico was also not, and there are others, right? And when I get asked this question by corporations or by universities, how should I think about ethnicity as a risk factor? I say you shouldn't think about it at all as a risk factor. What you really want to focus on is behavior. And when it comes to theft of intellectual property or data or something like that, what you're looking at are individuals who, certainly on the corporate side, are accessing information or spaces or research labs or whatever it is that are not within their field. So one of the things we see, for instance, at the university level is a professor has a visa to study in the United States with, at research lab X. But when you look at that, you realize the guy's not at lab X, which would have been totally fine, but he's at lab Z, where they are doing, controlled experiments. And so that's our message to the school. You need to know what folks are doing, right? We're not asking you to vet that professor, but once he comes, he should be where he is. There's one case which is, I can't get into too much, but where the person has a visa to study at one university and they're at another university, right? And the question to that second university is, well, who do you think this guy is and how is he here, right? So all that said, if you focus on behavior, the advantage of it is twofold. One, that's what's consistent with American values, right? It is not consistent with our values to focus on ethnicity. The second is you're going to catch people who are doing something wrong regardless of their motivation, right? So yes, there are the individuals who are doing this because they're part of the 1,000 Talents program. But there are other people who are doing similar behaviors, not necessarily lying about funding, but misusing university resources or taking funding, et cetera, and have different conflicts of interest, right? Or are trying to just aggrandize themselves, right? They're their own client in that case. You're going to catch those people and you're going to catch the other folks. And that's what you want to be doing in order to vindicate those, I think sort of traditional American values of integrity and transparency in academic research. So, as I said, I get it. I get the folks who have this concern. I think if you look at our cases, you'll see, that there have been folks from a variety of backgrounds. Now, I'll say this too, though. One of the difficulties we have in this area is that the Chinese government targets for co-optation individuals of Chinese ethnicity more than individuals of other ethnicities. All right, so their view, the Chinese government view, and you probably know this, Clay, as well as anybody, but of who's Chinese is anyone of Chinese ethnicity, regardless of citizenship.
Right.
Right. So even if you're here and you were born here and you're Chinese American, and all of us would say, hey, you're an American, they'd say, no, you're Chinese, right? That's not the way we think about. I was born in Italy, but I don't think the Italians claim me as an Italian. I grew up here working in the U.S. government. I think I'm pretty American, but that's not the way they think about it. And because of that, when they use the intelligence services or others to co-opt individuals, and sometimes what they're doing is taking advantage of residual ties in China. So, you have family there, or you might want to come back and have a job there. So you need to, do what we're asking you to do, or you're not going to have a future in China, or, your mom who's left behind is not going to have a future in China, et cetera. So part of the issue we face is, that we see the Chinese targeting these individuals of Chinese ethnicity. They also target others. As I said, these on the political espionage side, in our sort of 7 or 8 cases recently, they're about half and half Chinese ethnicity, non-Chinese ethnicity. So they'll do both, but that's where they focus their efforts.
Yeah, and so I understand that you have to go where the problem seems to be. But some people might ask that if you're looking so intensively at this group, that's why 80% of the economic espionage cases somehow involve China, and that's that sort of thing. Look at the department website. And so we have a question from a scholar in Hong Kong who's worked extensively on these recruitment programs, David Zweig, who has sent in a question about, what portion, he actually asked how many, I don't expect you to be able to say that, but, what portion of the people doing this work, the people of Chinese ethnicity doing this work, are somehow engaged in inappropriate behavior. Mm. Now, I know that's not a statistic that you can just rattle off. If you knew that, there would be charges and there would be procedures. But is the problem large? Is it small? Yeah.
So let me say a couple things. The first is, that 80% figure, just so we all know, that was the case before we did the China Initiative, right? So that is the history that led up to the China Initiative. And in fact, after the China Initiative, it's still about 80%. So it's not as if we ended up with 80% because we were only looking at China. The second piece is, as a proportion of, let's take Chinese students and researchers who are here, it is very small, right? Now, the denominator is 360,000, right? That's how many students are here from China on educational visas of one kind or another.
Right.
And they range the gamut from like high school to, postgraduate researchers and visiting professors, right? So that's the other thing here. I believe that, we need to remain open to Chinese students coming and studying in the US. And when we talk about the threat here, the vast majority of people aren't even in the realm of the universe of people who might pose a threat, right? First of all, if you're here in high school, if you're here in college also, you're not going to, because really, as you know, the Chinese are government and the Chinese companies are very technologically sophisticated and have excellent research and development capacities, right? So when they come here to steal, they're looking for that last 5%, right? In some field where they feel like they're behind the US company, or say in Europe, the European company. In order to know when you've seen the last 5% and take the last 5%, you actually have to be very good in your field to do that, right? So you're not a high school student, you're not even a college student, right? You may not even be a a graduate student, right? Before you get to that level of sophistication, because you're still learning the first 95%. And until you know that, you don't know, well, what is the key next step that is going to make this breakthrough, right? And where are the Americans, or where's that university in terms of that? So the risk pool is far, I can't put a concrete number on it, but it is a small percentage. Even the pool is a small percentage of 360,000. And then, of course, within that, the individuals who are actually doing things they shouldn't do is smaller still. That said, if you start with 360,000 as your denominator, even if a very small percentage is there, you could have, let's say, 2,000 people here very easily. I'm making that number up, so don't hold me to it, right? But that's a tiny percentage of 360,000, but that's still a big problem, right? And so that's kind of where we are. We're in absolute numbers, I'd say this is a significant issue, but in relative to the total population, it's a small piece. And I think one of the challenges just as a country that we're facing is, how do you protect against the miscreants while remaining open to the rest? Because I think, one of the reasons why all these students are coming here is we have great universities. And one of the reasons that they're great is that people come here from all over the world to study and do research. So the message to the universities is, help us play defense so you can continue to play offense and develop in all these different fields.
Now, that's a really important point that you've just made about how do we maintain the openness that has made American universities, American companies, the American economy so productive, so successful. And we have a number of students who have emailed to ask about, well, can I get a visa? Can I get a visa for the full stretch of my PhD program, as opposed to, I get approved for 1 year and then maybe I'm out,
right.
These kinds of questions. And you highlight that to a certain extent, America's strength has come from immigrants, people who have come here as students and stayed to become entrepreneurs and things like that.
Right.
One of the Paulson Institute did a study, and they concluded that 1/4 of all of the people teaching about artificial intelligence
right.
in American universities did their undergraduate work in China.
Right.
So we would be much less well off if we closed that door.
Right.
If I could ask about your outreach then to universities, so that you communicate, the points that you're making, that, you're looking to continue to encourage openness, exchange, collaboration, those sorts of things. But at the same time, you do have these concerns and you need help with it.
Yeah. Certainly pre-coronavirus, I was doing a lot of outreach to universities. That's why I'm so happy to do this, even if it's virtual. It's nice to have these discussions because obviously the opportunities for these are more limited these days. But we were doing a lot of outreach, and that was my sort of consistent message. It's also, I think, and it's where we, in listening to what we were hearing back too, it's where I think we developed this sort of enforcement sort of priority on integrity and transparency, right? Because it's a very different message with universities than with the private sector and the corporate side. If I go to a company and I say, your value comes from this nugget of intellectual property that you have and your competitor doesn't have, and you should be doing everything you can. A lot of people want to steal it, and you should be doing everything you can to protect it. They're like, yeah, no duh, like I knew that, help me protect it, tell me what the risks are, et cetera, right? If you go to a university, that doesn't make any sense. Right. In fact, if you look at how university sort of professors make a name in their field, they publish. Right. They're sharing their research. They're sharing their know-how. Right. They're not keeping it, except in a few fields. Medical schools are a little different sometimes. I mean, there are exceptions. Right. But for the most part, they're not monetizing a discovery. They're sharing the discovery, and then they, get the professional achievements and accomplishment that comes with that. And oftentimes those discoveries are the results of collaboration. Right. So in the university environment, in thinking through that, and that, I actually come from a family of university professors, so it's not all new to me, but then what's really important, it's integrity, right? It's transparency, regardless of the funding sources. I mean, think about the way that universities have long had to deal with big American funders, right? Who say, I'll give you $50 million, you're going to name that school after me, and I want you to teach X, right? And the school is very used to saying, and this is more on the foreign influence side if you take it and talk about foreign countries, but is used to saying, no, right? Like, thank you for your money. We'll name the school after you, but we have to keep the academic freedom. So, the schools value the transparency, right? And so in any research study that's published, you should be revealing the sources of your funding. Like if you're doing a study on alcoholism and your money's coming from the beer industry, you should say that, right? Or whatever other example you could have. So that's really where we wanted to focus when we focused on participation in 1,000 Talents program. Just letting the schools know what the risks are, and then, helping them and setting an expectation that they would be able to have transparency and integrity in terms of what professors were disclosing to them, as well as to the federal government when they applied to federal funds.
Are there only risks associated with the 1,000 Talents program, or are there any potential advantages for the universities?
Well, for the university, there could be. I mean, if it were transparent and open, for instance, and if a professor were through a 1,000 Talents program, let's say, getting funding for a lab at a U.S. university that was also getting funding maybe from the university or through some other sponsorship from on the U.S., they could then have a better lab, right? They could get more sophisticated equipment. They could hire more teaching assistants, more research assistants, and, help the university as well as themselves, right? And, share some of that credit with the Chinese university that was also helping to fund it. So I think there are advantages to universities in these collaborations, but if the professor's not being transparent about it, then the university isn't the one who's making that decision. And ultimately, I think that they need to be making that decision.
Okay, the key thing then is the transparency and integrity.
Yes. Yeah.
Been talking about, at some length. If we could say something more on the industry side.
Yeah.
On your outreach to industry, because, we've known for a long time that companies don't like to advertise to their shareholders and their customers.
Right.
We've hacked. We have these problems. And so can you, is there greater openness to acknowledging these problems? Now there are economic sanctions if you don't declare it, but What are you finding on the industry side?
So slowly, there's greater openness. I mean, in some places, I think we've had a significant shift. Take data breaches. There was a time when a retailer who was breached, the reaction of the public was, I'll never shop there again. Now, if you had that reaction right now about with all the data breaches that have happened, you would be shopping in cash at a thrift store, right? No receipts, thank you very much. I'll just take the shirts. So I think that means that, for a lot of companies, and of course the law has helped this, state laws have helped in terms of the disclosures. We're all used to getting these notices in the mail, and frankly, they don't really change our behavior anymore. I just got a notice 2 days ago from my local, hospital. Oh, your information was, breached. Well, I'm not going to go find a new hospital or lab to do my blood test. I'm going to keep going. So, so as a result of that, I think companies have gotten a little bit more comfortable coming forward. I think, our promise to them has been, when it comes to doing the investigations, we understand that they can be disruptive, but we will do our best to minimize the disruption on your other, sort of business activity. And we will keep you anonymous for as long as we can. Now, if a case goes to trial, we can't, obviously the defendant, it has to be public, the defendant will know, so we can't make that promise. But even when we indict cases, we will anonymize the name of the company very often, unless the company is okay with being identified. And, that means if the defendant pleads guilty, or if we can't find the defendant, it's a cyber case and the people are in China, that company will never be identified. And I think that's gotten them a little bit more comfortable about coming forward. The big issue when it comes to China with companies is, as you know, the economic disincentives from the Chinese market perspective to calling out actions of the Chinese government, right? And there are plenty of examples of this around, U.S. businesses. But aside from the real, even, putting aside sort of the very visible ones like the MBA or something like that last year, we do see, a lot of companies that know that they're being stolen from, they know they're being targeted from, but they're still hesitant to come forward because, they're worried about market repercussions in China. So that continues to be an obstacle that is, we'll just have to continue to deal with, down the road as it develops.
Is it possible to overcome that kind of hesitation if somebody's worried that, cutting themselves off from 1.4 billion consumers is the more important aspect of the company's economic future? How do you win that argument?
Yeah, look, at the end of the day, that's often a business decision that the company needs to make for itself. What we try to educate them about, and I think this is where some of our cases can be very useful, is, if you're entering into a joint venture with a Chinese company, don't assume that this is meant to be a mutually beneficial relationship that will last in perpetuity or, for 20 years in this way. Understand that in many of these cases, the ultimate goal of the Chinese company entered into a joint venture is to replace you in the marketplace, right? To learn from you, perhaps to steal from you, but ultimately to replace you. And so, an example, a perfect example of this was a few years ago in a Massachusetts company that was making wind turbines. AMSC was the name of the company, and they, entered into this joint venture with Sinovel, which is the Chinese company. And ultimately, their market differentiator was the software that, interacted between the turbine and the electric grid. And the Chinese company, through this joint venture, stole that software, then broke up the joint venture and, replaced them, because the making of the turbines itself wasn't the sophisticated piece. They could get someone else to help them make the turbines, but they now had the software that they needed. So our cases, I think, have helped with the business community because we can lay out these facts. And in a case like that, where we actually had to go to trial, we were able to show damages, number of jobs lost, number of market value lost, all the very meaningful numbers for businesses. And And that's very helpful when you go to the next business and talk about what the risks are going to be. And that's one of the advantages of indicting, some of these cases.
Getting it out there into the public sphere so that people can wrestle with these.
Right.
Question from one of my colleagues at USC. We frequently take students, MBA students and other students, to companies.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they do internships with these Chinese companies. And so my colleague asked, does this make us, meaning USC, or these students suspect in some way because we have afforded the students this opportunity? Are we beholden to these companies?
I don't, the way you've described it, it doesn't sound very suspicious to me. A part of a lot of business school programs is, to take the students around to different companies, have them hear from the company executives, have them see a production line or development, or, depending on the business. It's obviously up to the business in those arrangements to protect themselves. And I think we've all been to companies where we've been told, regardless of where we're coming from, you can't bring a camera, into this part of the building. Feel free to take a picture outside, but we're going into a lab, no cameras, right? And in those ways, the companies, know how to protect themselves. Obviously, when they're giving presentations to the students, they're avoiding the most proprietary aspects of their business. But that's, brings us to a good point that I think, including about doing business in China. Again, our message is never don't do business in China, don't do business with China. I don't think we should be separating ourselves out into two worlds and sort of rebuilding a different kind of Iron Curtain. The message has to be for a business, really think hard about what your crown jewels are, right? What really, you have a lot of intellectual property, okay? 80% of it, everybody else has something equivalent, right? Even if it's not that. 20%, maybe is, but really the stuff you're making all your money off of is a thin sliver. Protect that very carefully. And then feel free to do business with China or any other country, right? With the rest, right? But just be careful with that, that sort of key differentiator. That way you can continue to engage with that country, with that market, but not put your future at risk because you have put your sort of the heartland of your intellectual property at risk. And that's the same thing, obviously, any company that's thinking about it is going to do in any kind of the presentations you're talking about. I'll talk to you about 90% of what I do. The 10%, and really from an educational perspective, that's fine for the students, right? They don't need that last 10%.
That's right. Getting to 90% is already a good deal.
Usually you probably get to a lot less than that.
Right. You have to set your expectations appropriately. And
right.
In fact, the example that I would go to illustrate the point you just made is the Google example. In 2010, when they found their source code coming under attack from what they determined to be, state-sponsored hackers, that's when they pulled the plug and said, okay, our deal is off.
Right.
We're not going to censor our search results. Because, Google is an idea. Their economic vitality at that point was really tied up in the effectiveness, the quality of the search results that they returned. And so giving that up would have been quite ruinous. Maybe we could shift gears and focus on the question you just said, doing business with China, doing business in China, and that sort of thing. But also ask the question about how open, we've obviously been quite open to Chinese investment. That investment has diminished in recent years, not necessarily because of anything your office has done, but because of capital controls in China and other strategic, agenda items that they have. But Chinese companies still want to enter the American market. They still, in some cases, want to acquire American companies, sometimes in possession of important technologies. What is the process by which, or the standards by which, we ought to assess whether or not that's in America's best interest.
So this really brings us to, our work on what's, as you know, I think what's called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., right? Which goes back at this point probably about 30 years or even more, and traditionally has been focused on protecting kind of cutting edge technologies from foreign ownership, as well as, I should say, things like foreign countries, buying an office building in which the FBI has an office, or right next door to, the New York Police Department headquarters, or, things like that. Geographic sort of proximity, military bases is a common one. More recently, that committee is also focused on the risk of to sort of sensitive personal data, right? So that's brought into the jurisdiction of that committee, let's say, a life insurance company or a health insurance company or a financial services company that in the past would have never said, oh, I don't have any cutting edge technology, right? What national security threat could this pose? But we see from a variety of adversaries an appetite for Americans' sensitive personal data. So that's another risk that we look at. The process, is country agnostic to begin with, right? It's any foreign investment in the U.S. It's a change it's the acquisition of control of a company, but also now, after the law was expanded, sort of critical technologies or data from a company. And the key is, look, again, we need to remain open to foreign investment. So when we analyze those deals, we're really trying to focus on, is there a national security risk? We're not making a economic protectionism thing. This isn't, are the jobs going to go somewhere else? Or, is this other company going to get ahead of this other American company? It's very focused on these national security risks. And even with respect to China, which is, I would say fairly seen as one of the main sort of foreign country threat vectors when it comes to these acquisitions. Even with respect to China, I think just last week I approved, a deal that involved a Chinese company. So these, we're looking very specifically at the industry that's involved, the technology or the data that's involved, the links between a company and the government. And then the second question is, even if we do have risk, is there a way to mitigate this risk, right? Are there controls that we can put in place where you could say yes to the acquisition, but for instance, have data localization. So US person data is here in the US and the company doesn't need access to, the Chinese owner doesn't need access to it and doesn't have access to it. And, there are different mechanisms for securing that. If you can get there on mitigation, that's always our preference. In fact, in terms of blocked deal, there have been maybe 3 in the last several years that have been blocked. Formally blocked. There are others get withdrawn, because of the national security risks. But most of them are either cleared or they're cleared with mitigation. And again, it's an effort. Same on the corporate side, same on the university side, we want to bring in talent from around the world. I think on the corporate side, on the business side, we want to be open to foreign investment from around the world. And therefore, we have to really focus in on what the real risks are.
And this raises the question because most of the companies that we're talking about, the Chinese companies seeking to make acquisitions, are now privately owned companies. They're still subject to the Chinese government. There's been a strengthening of the party structure, all of those kinds of things, but they're private companies. And in the case, for example, of some of the seed thefts and things like that, those seem to be at the behest of a private Chinese firm. How is it possible for you at the Justice Department to distinguish between state actors and non-state actors?
Yeah, look, it depends on the country, right? So one of the factors we look at in every case is the company foreign government owned, or is it privately owned by a foreign individual, or is it publicly traded on one of the markets? and that's going to go into that risk calculus that we were talking about. The difficulty in China is, and even just, I think last week, President Xi announced an effort to, maintain further control over private companies in China and expecting them to further strengthen their ties to the Chinese Communist Party and through a variety of mechanisms. And so, the difficulty in China is that the state won't really let their companies be independent. And they are there, as President Xi said last week, to further the goals of the Chinese government, and they're expected to. Now, if they can do their business consistent with those goals, that's fine, and they want them to prosper and make money. But ultimately, if there's a choice, they've got to choose the Chinese government. In addition, you have, as you mentioned, you have a series of national security laws that require the companies to, share data, share information with the government. And because obviously we as a government also have an ability to do that. Right. But we have an independent judiciary that stands as a bulwark between, information I'd love to get from a company and the company, right? And the companies in the US are not shy about challenging a subpoena in court or, anything like that. And the judges are not shy on the front end about if we go and we ask for a search warrant, let's say, making sure we have probable cause. That doesn't exist in China, in the same way that it exists here. And so these are all factors that we need to consider as we think about, is the private ownership of this Chinese company enough to separate it from government control? Now, here too, the answer to that will also depend on a whole bunch of other factors, like what are they buying? Is it consistent with their overall business plan? So it looks like a legitimate purchase and they're not just trying to do something that government's asked them to do. So that's not the end of the analysis, but it's a piece of the analysis.
Yeah, so it's as you say, a part of the discussion. Now, you were talking about one of the mitigation measures that could be undertaken, and maybe that's what's going to come about with regard to the video game companies that apparently are now being asked about those that have investments or are owned by Tencent, how they're storing data. And as far as I know, in the United States, we don't have a data localization law as exists in Europe, now exists in China, and that sort of thing. And so, these companies, as you've already highlighted, the hospital, that you visited, there's a lot of our data floating around in hands, a variety of hands. Right. And so is this a useful protection? What makes this focus on Chinese access to that data important?
So, we start with what we've seen and is sort of reflected in our cases. Go to or not even necessarily all that we've charged, the hack of the Office of Personnel Management Records. So anybody with a security clearance, right? The Chinese government has their records. The hack of Equifax, right, for credit reports. The hack of Anthem, a health insurance company, and other hacks that we've seen. The Chinese government has a huge appetite for sensitive personal data. And we see them buying data, through data brokers. That's another sort of way to get data. And I think they want that for two reasons. The first is AI is really, one of the technologies of the future, right? And there's a big competition, as you know, between the U.S. and China, in the AI space. And in order to develop the sort of predictive analytics that AI and the algorithms that ultimately comprise AI, you need huge quantities of data. The more data you have, the better off your AI is going to be, right? So that's one. You need a lot of data. And the Chinese will get it from their own people too. It's not like those, they're not gathering data on their own folks. That's one. The other is more from a targeted counterintelligence perspective, right? So take any of the hacks that I talked about, including the OPM. Probably 95% of that stuff will never get looked at, right? But you don't know when some person, ascends to a position, or just, now they're sent to China. They're working at the embassy in China or something like that. And suddenly it becomes useful for you to paint a picture of that individual for intelligence purposes, possibly for recruiting purposes, right? Because if I'm an intelligence officer and I'm going to approach you, Clay, the more I can learn about you before we meet, at random, the better off I'm going to be, because we're going to have so much in common when we finally meet, right? So, it paints a picture, could paint a picture of my vulnerabilities. Wow, that guy needs money. That guy's trying to take care of his parents. He has health issues, whatever it is, right? So that's why we see that the Chinese wanting a lot of data. And that's why, one of the focuses and one of the things that Congress did when it expanded the CFIUS in FIRMA is the new law, was, make sensitive personal data one of the things that we should be looking at when it comes to these transactions. Now, will data localization be an answer, a successful mitigation? It depends on the case, right? So, it depends on whether the owner has a business need or interest in the data, or whether, for instance, someone who's more like an investor in a company, right? And maybe I'm buying it, but I'm not interested in merging it with my operations elsewhere in the world or in China, right? So I don't need to have that data together with my other data and in one data set. So, but I'm interested in making money because this company is making a lot of money, and that's great. That's great. And there, data localization can work. Data localization plus an inability for me as the investor to access the data can work and can serve the needs of both the investor who wants to buy the company and make a profit, and the national security needs of protecting that data, because he doesn't want the data, doesn't make business sense, and the company's fine protecting it. So there are many cases in which that's been a piece of the mitigation, where you say, you know what, that works. That there's really no incentive in you trying to get it. It doesn't mean that it's safe from every cyber intrusion, but of course that's true of American companies' data in America too, right? And you just have to look at our cases to see many examples of American companies, unnamed American companies, that have been intruded upon by hackers from various countries. So it can be an answer, or at least a piece of an answer, but it will very much depend on the sort of the business deal itself and what the purposes are. And other times, we've seen situations where a deal won't make sense unless you get the synergies of merging these, companies, right? And that then you have to decide then whether you're going to approve it or not.
Right. If you're not able to do what it is that would really drive profits in the future,
right,
then it's
then that's not going to be a good answer. Yeah.
And you highlighted that this is many of these worries exist just within the United States, where somebody works for company A and then suddenly now works for company B, started up company C, and they've taken property that originated with their employer. And so these kinds of things. You've been so generous with your time. If I could try and squeeze in two more questions.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. The first is, and they're both mega questions. So the first is, this program is not quite 2 years old. The emphasis, and if you could say something about the allocation of resources to the China initiative, what makes it an initiative? What as opposed to just a brand that we slapped on what we were going to otherwise.
What was going to happen anyway, right?
Yeah. And then if you could evaluate, where you are, what have been the successes, what areas need additional attention?
Yeah. So I think what's made it an initiative, so one of the things we're trying to do on the cyber side in particular, but also in some of these economic espionage cases, these are difficult cases to do, and they have foreign policy implications. what we were trying to do, and still trying to do, is send a message, because as you know, the way the Justice Department works, there's us and main justice, right? But then there are U.S. attorneys, 94 U.S. attorneys offices around the country, right, where most of the people are in the Justice Department, and that, feel at least in part like, they're being measured by metrics, right? So how many cases did you do? How many convictions did you get? And so these cases, these are not drug cases. These are not immigration cases. These are not gun cases, right? You're going to have a very small number of these cases in any given year as a U.S. Attorney's Office. And especially before 2014, but even before this, the notion was, gosh, these are so hard in terms of foreign policy, and we bring them to main justice, and the main justice says, I don't know if you can charge that case because of these other issues, or that I'm not going to, an investigator or prosecutor, I'm not going to spend my time doing it, because like all of us, I mean, that's ultimately our goal if we're prosecutors, is to finish the investigation and bring it to a charge if we can get there. And so part of it was the message to those U.S. attorneys' offices. We believe these cases are important. We understand that you're not going to do like 20 of these in a year. If you do one, great. If you do two, that's amazing. If you do zero, that's understandable. Maybe next year you'll have one, right? So one was that. Another was to, in order to really harness, and we talked about sort of the importance of cooperation with the private sector, the importance of, outreach to universities. There's only so much travel and speaking that I can do, right? So, but to harness the 94 U.S. attorneys and the 56 FBI field offices around the country, we needed to educate them on all of this, but not in a way. So we actually brought them all to DC, and we had like a day-long conference on these and other national security issues, all in a classified setting. Now, the problem is, if I brief you in a classified setting, you leave and you have no idea what you can repeat and what you can't repeat, right? So you go out and you meet with a company, and the only thing you can say is some platitudes because you don't want to say something that was classified. So we prepared a lot of materials that the U.S. attorneys could use that were very specific, that included no classified material, so that they could reach out, because ultimately I think those local connections are where it needs to happen. Like, if a company in Southern California gets a breach of some kind, or has an employee stealing intellectual property, they're not going to call me, right? They're going to call their local FBI office. They're going to call their local U.S. attorney's office, and that's where the relationship should be. So that was the other piece. How do we arm the U.S. attorneys to be able to do this outreach, to develop those relationships and all of that? And then on the resourcing side here, and so that becomes it's not like we added a lot of new positions, right? Although ultimately the U.S. attorney's offices have to figure out how to allocate their existing positions. So if they know this is a priority of the department, then they'll allocate those accordingly. In our, in my office, we have added additional attorneys on this side of the house. So not the terrorism side, but kind of on the nation state, national security side of the house. No one exclusively has like China initiative responsibilities. They do a variety of nation state counterintelligence investigations, leak investigations, et cetera. But that's where we have added additional resources because of the rise overall of the nation state threat, whether it's foreign interference from election interference from Russia, or intellectual property theft from China or Iran or North Korea or whatever it is.
And sorry, this is a kind of sub question, and that has to do with what sorts of special skills, knowledge, experiences are you looking for? And when I say you, I mean the Justice Department, to meet these challenges.
So, it's useful to have, especially if you're on the cyber side, attorneys that are comfortable with the sort of the tech language and the language of computer programming and software, and the way computer infrastructure works, the way the internet works, et cetera. Not everybody has to have an expertise in that when they come in, but they have to be comfortable learning it, right? And the best ones are able, because ultimately, let's say if you're going before a jury, whether it's a grand jury or a regular jury, you then have to express all those concepts in lay terminology that people can understand. So the best ones can understand it and speak the language of the tech guy with the tech guy, but turn around and translate to a lay individual the key points of that discussion as they relate to the case, right? So we're looking for, especially as I said on the cyber side, people that either already have sort of a proven track record of doing that, or are just able to learn how to do that and can develop those skills over time. On the counter espionage side, obviously, in addition to the fact that you'd better be able to get a security clearance, at that point, those were just looking for just good and experienced prosecutors. One area where what we do is hire, oftentimes, or go outside for consultant services is in the area of trade secrets, right? So if you bring an economic espionage case or you bring a theft of trade secrets case, one of the things you have to prove is that thing that was stolen was in fact a trade secret, right? And that's something that as like a generalist prosecutor, I can't always make the best assessment of. And so I need an outside expert in that field to tell me, no, that's really general knowledge. That wasn't something that's really a trade secret, or who can tell me enough and say, yeah, that was something that wasn't widely known, that was being protected, et cetera. And that obviously we do that with them, but there are times where in order to get that expertise, we need to reach out and do that.
Yeah, and so in that case, was it a secret and was it valuable?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That sort of thing. Are you worried that in mobilizing the 94 offices of U.S. attorneys and the 56 FBI offices and saying, well, we don't have a hard and fast quota, but we want you to focus on this, that those of us who study China are all too aware that quota setting can lead to utter disaster, that it can lead to really bad choices. Are you worried about that? Or are there sufficient internal checks to make sure that the prosecutions are fair, that they represent American values?
Right. So I think some of those internal checks, for instance, to charge economic espionage, which is a specific sort of criminal charge, you need the approval of the National Security Division, right? Now, so for that sort of very key charge, you need our approval. For other charges, you need to consult with us, so you don't need our approval. So those are all ways in which, we're trying to ensure consistency across of practice, right across the country. And also, offering our services to help people if they're evaluating, what's a trade secret, how do these cases go? Because as I said, these cases can arise anywhere in the country, but it's not, in some pockets especially, it's not like you're going to have people who have done many of these in the past. And so, you offer your expertise and your consultants, but you're also ensuring uniformity of the application of these laws. So that's the way we try to address some of the problem. We absolutely don't set quotas, in these cases. And as I said, our message to them is we're actually not expecting you to have a high number of cases, right? And we understand if you don't have any, as I said, if you have one, great. If you have two, fantastic. But so we're trying to avoid, what the situation that you're, talking about, the risk that you're describing. And look, that's not something that is unique to the China initiative. That's something that we as a department, whatever the priorities are, at any given time, always need to be careful of.
Thank you so much. And you've been so generous with your time. If I could sneak in one last question that comes from one of our attendees.
I do have to go soon though, Clay, sorry. But go ahead, please ask it.
This is really it. And that's, what is the future of the China initiative. Is this essentially tied to this particular administration and an all-of-government approach to China, or is this likely to continue regardless of who sits in the White House?
Right. I think the answer to that is it's likely to continue either way. And the reason I say that is, look, I point to the 2014 indictment of the Chinese PLA that was, during the Obama administration. I know I wasn't here then, but I know the folks who were involved in that. And I know, what it took to get there, because as I said, it's a big deal to indict members of another country's military, of course. But they got there, and we've been building on that. I mean, one of the very nice things I think about this division here in the department is I do feel like we've always been building on one another's works, and it hasn't oscillated greatly depending on who's in charge. So that I think from the department perspective, I have no idea like what the new administration, new priorities. But I do think that the focus on China, theft of intellectual property from China, will remain. If you just look out there generally, this has been a bipartisan issue. When I testified at the Senate Judiciary Committee after we launched this, it was a very bipartisan, supportive, and that committee is not always bipartisan, very bipartisan, supportive hearing in which the most critical questions were from the Democrats, but they were like, why aren't you doing more? And not, sort of questioning why we were doing what we were doing. So I think, by and large, that this will continue as a priority of the departments. But only time will tell.
That's right. None of us, the future is pretty elusive.
Exactly.
Can't predict that. I really want to thank you for the time you've given us, how you've deepened our understanding of the China Initiative, both in terms of its goals and in terms of its operation, plus how the CFIUS works, the kinds of questions that get asked there. You've really helped us to understand these things, and I'm grateful to you. We have, by the way, for the attendees, on our website, Mr. Demers just mentioned, his congressional testimony and things like that. We have links to these things at the U.S.-China Institute website. So if you'd like to dig in a little bit more, you can do that. Mr. Demers, thank you.
Thank you, Clay. Yeah, and thanks to everyone who was on. Really appreciate the questions and the conversation, and look forward to doing it again.
Well, and hopefully next time in LA.
I hope so. I hope so. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks to everybody for joining us. We look forward to having you back.